Hey everyone, welcome back to my Python programming tutorials. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about functions. Now, there is quite a bit to talk about functions, so I will be splitting this entire lesson into two parts. In the first part, we'll talk about function naming, function calls, parameters, and function body, basically the syntax of how to write a function. In the second part of this, we'll talk about a little more in-depth concepts such as the single responsibility principle, returning versus printing within a function, and function scope. So firstly, to get started, I'm sure you've seen these along the way of the programming series so far. You can think of a function as very similar to a mathematical function. So let's think about the quadratic function. All it is, it's just y is equal to x squared. That is the function. In math, we can kind of replace this with f of x. So it's a function that intakes a parameter of x, and then it will give us back the value of x squared. In Python, we can write a similar function and it would be written like this. We can call it quadratic, it will intake a parameter of x, and it will simply return us the y value, which is just going to be that x value squared. So now let's go over the syntax of how to write a function. In Python, the way you would write a function is by starting off with the def keyword or the define keyword. So first you would write define, then you would write the function name, then you would put these parentheses, and within the parentheses you would put all of the parameters needed for the function. After you have written this, you would put this colon right here signifying that the function signature is over and that now it's time to move on to the body of the function. So the body of the function would be written right here with an indent, or I think this is going to be 4 spaces. Yep. So you'd write the body of the function in here, and then that would be a complete Python function. So firstly, let's start off with this. This is the function's name. And in Python, and in all other languages actually, function names should be descriptive and should tell you the functionality of the function. It's better to name a function longer and more descriptive than have a really short named function and have people not understand exactly what it does and need to go look into like the source code of it. Now, if the function is simply too long to name, maybe you name it something shorter and you leave something known as a docstring. So a docstring is just going to be 3 of these quotes, and then you're going to write whatever you want in here, and then you're going to close these 3 quotes. This is basically a docstring. It's a documentation string in Python, so people will be able to see exactly what the function or method is supposed to do. Now moving on to function calls. Function calls is basically how we use the function. As you can see, I have a little bit of a different setup today. I have my file over here in which I write the code, and then I have my shell over here. So how do I use this function that I just wrote? Well, I would need to call it from within the shell. So firstly, I would save this file and I would restart the shell by clicking F5 on the file to make sure that Python is aware of the function that I've just written, and then I can simply call it. The way you can call a function or like invoke it or use it is by writing its name. So in this case, it's quadratic. And then we would put open and close parentheses. And within the parentheses, we would need to pass in whatever parameters it requires. So in this case, it requires an x variable, which let's just say it's going to be 2. And as you can see, it returns us 2 squared, which is going to be 4. Now, if I were to try and call this function right here without those parameters, you could see that Python will throw me an error saying missing 1 required positional argument x, and we would simply have to refer back to the code of the function and see that, well, it really does need this parameter of x, so we should include it when we make our function call. So to show you a little bit more in depth, I've created this function called func, and all it does is simply print I got called whenever it gets called. So if I write func, and again, it requires no parameters, so I'm not going to pass it any parameters. If I call it, it's simply going to execute the code within its body, which simply prints I got called. Now, we do need to include these open and close parentheses when we are trying to call a function. If we don't include these open and close parentheses, you will simply be returned the actual function object that Python has stored in memory. So as you can see right here, this is because when you create a function, Python associates the name of the function with the actual function definition in memory, or in this case it's an object. So if you don't call it by including the open and close parentheses, you're simply going to get the function's definition or like the function in memory. We do sometimes need to do this. For example, I know if we're trying to use the filter function in Python, well, the first parameter required to the filter is an actual function definition. So you will be passing something like, okay, func, instead of open and closing the parentheses. So you will just be passing the function definition just like this, and then the filter method will use this function. So sometimes we want to explicitly call the function ourselves, and this will actually happen the majority of the times, but other times we will need just a reference to the function in memory, and we can do that just by writing its name and excluding the open and close parentheses. I'm going to skip over the parameters, and we'll cover that later just because there's quite a bit more to it than there is with everything else. I'm going to move on to the body of the function, and as you can guess, well, the body of the function is simply what the function is supposed to do. So in the case of this quadratic, all it's going to do is it's going to square this input parameter of x, and then it's just going to return it. Now in the case of this other func that I created, all it's going to do is it's going to print something, and in this case it's I got called. So the body is where you include all of the logic of your function to ensure that it carries out its desired functionality. Now moving on to parameters. This is probably going to be the largest portion, so I suggest you pay attention just because there's quite a bit of stuff here. So the parameters to a function are basically variables that we would like the function to use from other scopes. So we'll talk about function scope in part 2 of this tutorial, but basically parameters are just variables that we would like to use within our function. We can define regular variables. Let's define a function over here that takes in x, y, and z as parameter. These are simple parameters. There's not much to them. Every time you call the function, you're basically going to include 3 arguments to the function call. Now note, you can also include default parameters. So for example, in this function, if we create it, let's call this function adder, and all it's going to do is simply just going to return their sum. So if I call adder right now, I'm going to need to include each of these parameters. So let's say I'm going to include 1, 2, and 3 as arguments. So these are called arguments to the function, and these are called the parameters. Don't get them mixed up. You could see that it's just simply going to return us the sum of 1, 2, and 3, which is 6. You can also have default parameters for your function. They have to be included in the function signature, and they must be at the end of all of the parameters. So let's say I wanted to add at most 3 numbers, but I could also add 1 number or 2 numbers. So the way I can do this is I could simply say, okay, y is going to equal to 0 and z is going to equal to 0 if they are not passed. So before, if I were to call this function and we didn't have these default parameters set right here, well, if I were to call it without x, y, and z, the function would throw me an error and say, hey, it's missing these positional arguments. But now I only need to pass it 1 argument, which is just the x value, and let's see how this functions. So now if I call adder with just 1, well, it's going to return me 1. Why? Because it adds x, y, and z. X in this case is going to be 1 because I've passed it in as an argument to the function over here. But in the function signature, it says if y is not passed, just default to 0. If z is not passed, just default to 0. So it's going to be 1 plus 0 plus 0, which is just 1. Now I can specify an x and a y and a z value if I would really want to. I can do again 1, 2, 3, and in this case it would return a 6 because it would overwrite this equals 0 as a default argument, and it would set them to the arguments called. Now I can just pass it just x and y if I wanted to as well. Again, it would just default to z being 0. I can also pass it in x and a z, so ignoring that y. And you can see that this still works, just the y is going to default to being 0 in this case. So now that we've created this little adder function that could add us 1, 2, or 3 numbers, let's try and expand a little more and create this adder to add potentially n numbers, so an unknown amount of parameters. How would we do that? Well, in Python there is a special syntax. If you include the star before your argument name, the function will expect n amount of arguments, so it could be as many as you want. So usually this is called star args, but you can name this whatever you want. You can name the star nums, and for this case let's just name it star num. So once we put the star in front of it, Python will expect an unknown amount of arguments, meaning you can pass it however many you want. So now let's change this function to add as many numbers as we want together. So the first thing to note is that this nums over here will be an immutable tuple. So if I were to print nums and then I were to print the type of nums over here, this function right now won't be adding anything. It'll just print us nums and the type of nums, and I just want to show you what it's going to look like. So if I call adder now with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, well, you could see it's going to give us a tuple of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and again, it's of type tuple. We can just say return the sum of nums, and this is a very Pythonic way to do it, but if you couldn't figure out the solution, you can simply just iterate over the tuple and then add them together and then return that final sum. So now if I call adder with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you can see that it gives us the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So what I'm trying to show is that this star over here is basically just going to allow the function to intake any number of arguments that we want it to. Now, the last type of special parameter is the double star. And again, it's usually referred to as keyword args or KW args. But again, you can rename this to anything. You can rename this to just args if you really wanted to. So the double star allows us to take keyword arguments. So before, in this adder function, when we put the star, we would receive a tuple of arguments. But now we are going to receive a dictionary of these arguments. So if I just go ahead and print args and then I print the type of args, we can see what this input will be. So now I'm going to make a call to this function. Again, the double star allows us to put as many arguments as we want. So let's say our first argument is called hello, and we want to equal to by, and then let's say we want another argument, maybe we'll say world, and that's equal to 1. Our last argument is going to be last, and it's going to be the string version of 2. So now if I call this function, you could see that the args over here is going to be a dictionary of key value pairs. So this hello is going to be a key and the by is going to be a value. Now obviously you can go ahead and do whatever you want with these arguments. I'm not going to try and write out a function to do some specific task, but I just want to show you that the single star will let us take in a bunch of unnamed arguments, and the double star will let us take in a bunch of named arguments. We'll store them in a dictionary, and then we can iterate over it or do whatever we want with that dictionary later. So the star syntax is referred to as positional arguments, and the double star is referred to as keyword arguments. Now in Python there is another one, it's called the keyword positional arguments, but I won't be covering them. You can look into that in the Python documentation. I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard. So yeah, that's it for this video on functions. Basically just all about functions, when we can use them, how we can write them, and what each component of a function is. We've also covered parameters and the different ways we can intake a bunch of parameters, that being the regular parameters, default parameters, the positional parameters using the star, or the keyword parameters using the double star. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If the video has helped you out at all, please like and comment as to what it helped you out with. Like usual, if you're new to the channel, please like, comment, and subscribe. And yeah, I will catch you guys in the next video where we will dive more in depth about functions.